On the morning of May 15th, 1943, something impossible was happening at Carlsbad Army Airfield in New Mexico. Smoke was rising from a brand new hangar. Flames were spreading across the control tower. A general's automobile was burning in the parking lot, and several tiny creatures, each weighing less than half an ounce, were responsible for all of it. The bats had escaped. They had been fitted with miniature napalm bombs, experimental weapons designed to burn Japanese cities to the ground. Now they were burning an American military base instead. Firefighters from nearby towns rushed to help, their sirens wailing across the desert. But military police turned them away at the gates. This was a top-secret project. No civilians allowed. So soldiers stood watching helplessly behind locked fences as their own facilities went up in flames, victims of a weapon so strange that most Americans would not learn of its existence for another 40 years. The fire spread from building to building, the air filled with acrid smoke. Heat waves rippled across the tarmac where aircraft should have been parked. All because of several bats, each carrying a tiny incendiary device clipped to its chest, each doing exactly what nature had designed it to do, and seeking dark, sheltered places to roost as the morning sun rose over the New Mexico desert. This is the story of Project X-Ray, the bat bomb. It is the story of a Pennsylvania dentist who convinced President Franklin Roosevelt to weaponize millions of flying mammals. It is the story of a weapon that actually worked, that military scientists concluded could start 10 to 20 times more fires than conventional bombs for the same payload weight. And it is the story of how that weapon was cancelled just months before deployment, replaced by something even more terrible, the atomic bomb. The man behind this extraordinary project was Dr. Lytle Adams, though everyone called him Doc Adams. He was born on January 31st in Paint Lick, Kentucky, a small community in rural Garrard County. His exact birth year is disputed in historical records. His gravestone at East Lawn Palms Cemetery in Tucson, Arizona, reads 1881. Academic Dental History Journals, published by the National Institutes of Health list, 1883. What is certain is that by 1941, Adams was a successful dental surgeon practicing in Irwin, Pennsylvania, a small town about 22 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, in Westmoreland County. But Adams was far more than an ordinary small-town dentist who filled cavities and pulled teeth. He was an inventor possessed by restless curiosity, an amateur pilot who understood the practical challenges of aviation, and an irrepressible self-promoter who had already left his mark on American aviation history. His dental practice had made him wealthy enough to pursue his true passion, which was dreaming up solutions to problems that other people had not even recognized yet. His most important pre-war invention was a non-stop airmail pickup system, patented in the late 1920s. This ingenious device solved a problem that plagued rural mail delivery. Small towns without airports could not receive airmail because planes had nowhere to land. Adams designed a system that allowed airplanes to snag and deliver mailbags without ever touching the ground. A weighted cable hung from the aircraft. 2 poles on the ground supported a rope stretched between them, from which a mailbag dangled. The pilot would fly low between the poles, hook the rope with the cable, and the mailbag would be pulled aboard. Simultaneously, an outgoing mailbag could be dropped. The whole exchange took seconds. Adams demonstrated his system publicly at Hoover Field in Arlington, Virginia, on March 9, 1930. Dignitaries and journalists watched as a small aircraft swooped down, grabbed a mailbag, and climbed away without slowing. He showed it again at the 1934 Century of Progress Exposition in Chicago, where it attracted considerable attention from aviation enthusiasts and postal officials. By 1929, he had even tested ship-to-shore airmail pickup from the ocean liner SS Leviathan, proving the system could work over water. Adams poured his personal fortune into promoting this invention, traveling the country to give demonstrations and court investors. Eventually, industrialist Richard DuPont, heir to the chemical fortune, acquired the patent rights and commercialized them through All American Aviation. That company began scheduled airmail service on May 12, 1939, using Adams' pickup system to serve communities throughout Pennsylvania and West Virginia that had no airports. All American Aviation would ultimately evolve into Allegheny Airlines, and later into a predecessor of U.S. Airways. Adams had changed how mail moved across America. It was through this airmail invention that Adams made a connection that would change history. He met Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the governor of New York who would soon become First Lady of the United States. She was a champion of rural reform, deeply concerned with bringing modern services to isolated communities. She was also an aviation enthusiast who held a student pilot's license and had once taken the controls during a celebrated night flight with Amelia Earhart. The non-stop airmail pickup system appealed to both interests. Adams cultivated this connection through correspondence and shared acquaintances in the aviation community. This professional relationship, forged years before the war, would prove decisive. On December 7, 1941, the Empire of Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Japanese aircraft destroyed or damaged 21 ships of the Pacific Fleet. 188 American aircraft were destroyed on the ground. 2,403 Americans died that Sunday morning. The United States declared war on Japan the following day. Like millions of Americans, Doc Adams heard the news and burned with anger. He wanted to strike back at the nation that had launched this treacherous assault. But unlike most Americans, Adams had recently witnessed something that gave him a unique idea for revenge. Something that would haunt his imagination as he listened to President Roosevelt address Congress and ask for a declaration of war. He had been vacationing in the American Southwest, visiting Carlsbad Caverns National Park in southeastern New Mexico. There, at dusk, during the warmer months, he had watched one of nature's most spectacular phenomena. Millions of Mexican free-tailed bats streaming out of the cave mouths in a dense, spiraling column that took hours to fully emerge. The bats flew out in such numbers that they appeared on weather radar as a storm cloud. The sound of their wings filled the air like distant thunder. The sight had made a deep impression on Adams, this army of small creatures emerging from the darkness in overwhelming numbers. Now, with Pearl Harbor burning and America at war, two ideas connected in his mind with the force of revelation. Japanese cities were built primarily of wood and paper. Traditional construction methods that had evolved over centuries used bamboo frames, rice paper screens, straw tatami mats, and wooden structures packed closely together along narrow streets. Unlike European cities with their stone and brick buildings, Japanese urban areas were extremely vulnerable to fire. American military planners already knew this. Intelligence reports emphasized that incendiary attacks on Japan could be devastatingly effective. And here were millions of tiny, flying creatures that could carry small payloads and that instinctively sought out dark, sheltered roosting spots at dawn. Places like attics, eaves, the spaces beneath roofs, the cracks between walls, places where a small fire would be hardest to detect and most likely to spread before anyone noticed. Adams spent the following weeks researching bats obsessively, visiting libraries, corresponding with naturalists, and refining his concept. He identified 4 biological properties that made bats ideal weapons carriers. First, they existed in enormous populations, numbering in the tens of millions, easily sufficient to supply a sustained bombing campaign. Second, despite weighing less than half an ounce, they could carry more than their own body weight in flight, providing the payload capacity needed for incendiary devices. Third, they could be placed into hibernation through cooling, eliminating the need for food, water, or care during transport across the Pacific. And fourth, at dawn they instinctively dispersed across wide areas and sought concealed roosting spots within structures, exactly the targeting behavior a weapon needed. On January 12, 1942, barely 5 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Adams submitted his proposal directly to the White House. His letter opened with characteristic dramatic flair. He wrote that he was attaching a proposal designed to frighten, demoralize, and excite the prejudices of the people of the Japanese Empire. He described bats as the lowest form of animal life, whose reasons for creation had remained unexplained by science or religion. He declared them placed there by God to await this hour to play their part in the scheme of free human existence. It was grandiose language, even bombastic, but Adams believed every word of it. Most citizen proposals for exotic weapons went directly into government wastebaskets. Thousands of Americans sent ideas to Washington during the war, from death rays to invisible submarines to trained attack seagulls. Almost all were ignored by overworked military bureaucrats who had neither time nor patience for amateur inventors. But Adams had something the others did not. He had a connection to the First Lady of the United States. Eleanor Roosevelt served as the conduit that placed the bat bomb proposal on her husband's desk. The president did not dismiss it out of hand. Instead, he forwarded it to Colonel William Joseph Donovan, director of the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence agency that would later become the Central Intelligence Agency. Donovan was known as Wild Bill for his willingness to consider unconventional approaches. Roosevelt attached a note that has become one of the war's most memorable marginalia. The president wrote that this man is not a nut, that it sounds like a perfectly wild idea, but is worth looking into. That note opened doors that would normally have remained closed to a small-town dentist with a scheme involving bats. Donovan assigned the evaluation to Stanley Platt Lovell, director of OSS Research and Development. Lovell was responsible for developing the gadgets and devices that agents would use behind enemy lines. Exploding coal, silenced pistols, suicide pills. He was accustomed to strange ideas. He routed Adams' proposal to Division 19 of the National Defense Research Committee, which handled unconventional weapons research. Harris Chadwell, chief of Division 19, recruited the ideal evaluator, a young Harvard zoologist named Donald Redfield Griffin, who had recently completed his doctorate. Griffin was not just any bat expert. He was pioneering the study of how bats navigate using sound waves, research so groundbreaking that he would coin the very term echolocation in 1944. His scientific work would revolutionize understanding of animal sensory systems. If anyone could assess whether bats could be weaponized effectively, it was Griffin. In April 1942, Griffin delivered his assessment. He wrote that the proposal seems bizarre and visionary at first glance, but that extensive experience with experimental biology convinced him that if executed competently, it would have every chance of success. He predicted the weapon would cause severe damage to property and morale. He emphasized that the biological characteristics Adams had identified were accurate. Bats really could carry significant payloads. They really did seek out exactly the kinds of roosting spots that would be ideal for starting hard to detect fires. On Griffin's endorsement, President Roosevelt approved the project for development. The official Chemical Warfare Service history records it simply. President Roosevelt okayed it, and the project was on. A Pennsylvania dentist had talked his way from a cave in New Mexico to the Oval Office, and the United States military was about to spend the next 2.5 years and approximately $2 million, equivalent to roughly $35 million today, trying to weaponize bats. The project was assigned to the Army Chemical Warfare Service in conjunction with the Army Air Forces. Adams, granted the status of a civilian consultant, assembled one of the war's most unusual research teams. They were not military men or established scientists for the most part. They were an eccentric collection of individuals that Adams recruited personally. He brought on Jack von Blocher, a mammalogist from the Los Angeles County Museum who knew more about bat behavior than almost anyone in the country. He recruited 2 young lab assistants named Jack Kufer and Harry Fletcher, both still in high school when they joined the project. Lieutenant Tim Holt, a 24-year-old Western film star who had appeared in movies alongside his father, joined as a pilot. Holt brought celebrity glamour to the team and proved to be a skilled aviator. The crew also included some colorful characters whose backgrounds raised eyebrows. An ex-gangster named Patricio Batista, who claimed to have worked for Al Capone in Chicago, served as a general assistant. A lobster fisherman from the East Coast named Ray Williams brought practical skills for handling creatures that most people found repulsive. Adams later claimed his search team visited 1,000 caves and 3,000 mines across the American Southwest and Mexico, with one car in their convoy covering 350,000 miles, looking for ideal bat populations. The team selected the Mexican free-tailed bat as the weapon's biological component. These small mammals weighed only 7 to 12 grams, roughly 1/3 of an ounce, small enough to fit in the palm of a child's hand. Yet testing showed they could carry payloads of 15 to 18 grams, approximately their own body weight, without difficulty in flight. Captain Wiley Carr's official testing report specified that the bats carried 11 grams without trouble, 18 grams satisfactorily, and 22 grams with noticeable difficulty, but still remaining airborne. 2 larger bat species were considered and rejected. The mastiff bat, North America's largest bat species, could theoretically carry a 1-pound stick of dynamite. This would have provided enormous destructive power per bat. But mastiff bats existed in insufficient numbers for military use. Their colonies were too small and too scattered to supply a bombing campaign. The mule-eared or pallid bat, found throughout the American West, proved insufficiently hardy for transport. They died at unacceptable rates when subjected to the cooling needed for hibernation during long flights. The advantage of Mexican free-tailed bats was their sheer population scale. Carlsbad Caverns alone housed approximately 9 million of them during summer months. But even larger colonies were discovered in the Texas Hill Country. Ney Cave near Bandera and nearby Bracken Cave together housed an estimated 20 to 30 million bats. At these caves, the evening bat emergence took 5 continuous hours as the column of animals flew out to hunt insects. They emerged in a dense stream 15 feet in diameter, like a living river flowing into the darkening sky. 1 million bats could theoretically be collected in a single night using nets placed over cave entrances. In late July 1942, Griffin and Adams traveled to Carlsbad Caverns and netted approximately 500 bats for transport back to Harvard. The bats were placed in cooled containers to induce hibernation and loaded onto a train for the journey east. Only about 300 survived the trip. The mortality rate was high, but Griffin established a critical finding. Bats could be maintained in hibernation for up to 2 weeks at 10 degrees Celsius, around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This confirmed the feasibility of long-distance transport. Bats could be cooled into dormancy at collection sites in Texas or New Mexico, loaded onto bombers at bases in Alaska, flown across the Pacific Ocean, and dropped over Japanese cities. They would revive during descent as the warmer air at lower altitudes reached them. By the time they reached rooftop level, they would be fully awake and ready to seek roosting spots. The biology was sound. The incendiary component required a different kind of expertise. The military turned to Dr. Louis Frederick Pfizer, the Sheldon Emery Professor of Organic Chemistry at Harvard. Pfizer was not just any chemist. He was the inventor of military napalm, the jellied gasoline that would become infamous in later wars. He first created the formula in his laboratory on Valentine's Day, February 14, 1942, mixing gasoline with naphthalene and palmitate to create a sticky, slow-burning gel that clung to whatever it touched. Pfizer designed what became known as the H2 unit for the bat bomb project. It was an oblong celluloid capsule 3/4 of an inch in diameter and 2.5 inches long, small enough to be clipped to a bat's chest without preventing flight. The capsule was filled with concentrated napalm gel. He produced 2 versions to accommodate different bat sizes and mission requirements. A 17-gram model burned for 4 minutes with a 10-inch flame. A heavier model, weighing approximately 1 ounce, or 28 grams, burned for 6 minutes with a 12-inch flame. Both flames were hot enough to ignite wood, paper, straw, and cloth. The timer mechanism was elegantly simple, requiring no electricity or complex machinery. A firing pin was held under spring tension by a thin steel wire inside the device. When the incendiary was armed before the bats were dropped, a small amount of copper chloride solution was injected into a cavity containing the wire. The acid slowly corroded the wire over a period of hours. When the wire finally snapped from corrosion, the firing pin was released and struck a small percussion cap igniter, which lit the napalm. The delay period could be precisely adjusted by varying the concentration of the copper chloride solution, allowing planners to ensure all devices ignited simultaneously across an entire city. The delivery system evolved through multiple design iterations as engineers worked to solve the challenge of dropping over 1,000 bats per bomb without killing them. The final version was a sheet metal canister, approximately 5 feet long, designed to fit inside a standard bomb bay alongside conventional weapons. Inside the canister were 26 circular stacked trays, each 30 inches in diameter. Each tray held 40 bats in individual compartments lined with mesh that allowed air circulation. A fully loaded canister contained 1,040 hibernating bats. The operational plan, developed by military planners, called for 10 B-24 Liberator heavy bombers, flying from bases in Alaska over Japanese industrial cities at night. Each bomber would carry 100 casings in its bomb bay and attached to wing hardpoints. A single mission involving 10 aircraft would release 1,040,000 armed bats over Japan, each bat carrying its own incendiary device set to ignite hours later. The casings would drop from 5,000 feet, tumbling through the darkness over sleeping cities. At approximately 4,000 feet, small explosive charges would deploy parachutes from each canister. The parachutes would slow descent dramatically. As the casings drifted lower, the outer shells would open automatically, releasing the bats into the warm night air. The warming temperatures during descent would gradually revive the hibernating animals from their torpor. By the time they reached rooftop level, they would be fully awake and seeking shelter from the approaching dawn. Following their natural instincts, the bats would disperse across a radius of 20 to 40 miles from the drop point, far wider coverage than any conventional bomb could achieve. They would seek out dark roosting spots inside buildings throughout the target area: attics, eaves, spaces between walls, gaps in roofing tiles, ventilation openings. Every crevice that could shelter a small mammal from daylight would potentially contain a bat with a napalm bomb attached to its chest. Hours later, as morning advanced and the city's residents went about their daily routines, the copper chloride would finish corroding the steel wires. Thousands of incendiary devices would ignite simultaneously. Thousands of small fires would start in the most concealed and inaccessible parts of thousands of buildings. By the time smoke became visible, the fires would already be burning inside walls and above ceilings, spreading through dry wood and paper. Fire watchers on rooftops, a common civil defense measure in Japanese cities, would be useless against fires that started inside the structures they were supposed to protect. Testing began in earnest in the spring of 1943. On May 2nd, Adams and his team arrived at Muroc Dry Lake in California, the remote desert site that would later become Edwards Air Force Base. Approximately 3,500 bats collected from Carlsbad Caverns were placed in refrigeration units and loaded into cardboard containers designed to simulate the final bomb casings. A B-25 Mitchell medium bomber carried them to 5,000 feet over the empty desert and released them. The results were what one observer called an unadulterated disaster. The cardboard containers did not open properly. The parachute deployment was ragged. Most bats had not recovered from hibernation during the descent through cold upper air. They plummeted to the desert floor in their containers or tumbled loose and struck the sand, dying on impact. The few that did revive flew erratically, disoriented and sluggish. Over 6,000 bats were expended in the Army's various experiments at Muroc, with little useful data to show for the effort. The team relocated to the Carlsbad Army Airfield Auxiliary Air Base in New Mexico for further testing. They needed to work closer to their bat supply and refine their procedures in an environment they could better control. By mid-May, they were conducting experiments with live incendiary devices attached to actual bats, working toward the first realistic test of the complete weapon system. On May 15, 1943, the project achieved its most famous and most embarrassing result. During a test involving live incendiary devices, several armed bats escaped containment. Accounts differ on precisely how this happened. Jack Coofer, who was there as a young lab assistant and would later write a book about the project, described how the New Mexico heat prematurely awakened dormant bats that had been fitted with live H, 2 incendiary units for a photography session documenting the attachment process. The bats were supposed to remain sluggish from cold. Instead, the desert sun warmed them faster than expected. They woke up and flew away, carrying their armed napalm devices. Captain Carr's official report blamed a careless handler who left a door open during a procedure. Other accounts simply note that a small number of bats escaped, without specifying how. What is certain is that several armed bats got loose on the airfield. That small number was enough. The bats did exactly what they were designed to do. They sought out dark, sheltered roosting spots as dawn approached. They found them under a fuel tank at the edge of the airfield. They found them inside the rafters of newly constructed hangars. They found them beneath the wooden eaves of administration buildings and barracks. They crawled into every crevice and gap they could find on the newly constructed, largely unoccupied military installation. And then, after the prescribed delay, the incendiary devices ignited. Fires erupted across the base almost simultaneously. Smoke rose from the air traffic control tower. Flames licked up the walls of a barracks building. A hangar caught fire, its wooden frame igniting despite the corrugated metal siding. A general's automobile, parked in the shade beneath an overhang where a bat had roosted, burst into flames. Because the project was classified top secret at the highest levels, civilian firefighters summoned by the smoke were barred from entering the base. Military police locked the gates and posted guards. Fire trucks from nearby towns arrived with sirens wailing, only to be turned away by armed soldiers who could not explain why they were being refused entry. Personnel on the base watched helplessly as their facilities burned, unable to call for help or explain the situation to anyone outside the fence. No one was injured because the base was largely unoccupied, still under construction and not yet fully staffed, but the damage was extensive. Several buildings burned to their foundations. The control tower was gutted, the general's car was destroyed. The fires provided vivid, undeniable proof that the weapon concept worked. Adams, characteristically undaunted by the disaster he had inadvertently caused, saw the bright side immediately. He reportedly declared that in a way this accident proved the bat bomb would work. He pointed out what only a handful of bats could do. Imagine what 1,000,000 could do to a Japanese city. Captain Carr's official secret report, dated June 8, 1943, stated only that testing was concluded when a fire destroyed a large portion of the test material. Army tests were formally called off on May 29, 1943. The embarrassment of burning down an American military base with bats was too much for Army commanders to accept. But the project was far from over. The accident had demonstrated effectiveness, not failure. In August 1943, the Army handed the project to the United States Navy. The Navy gave it an official code name, Project X-Ray. Rear Admiral D.C. Ramsey, Chief of the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, championed continued development. He saw potential where Army commanders saw only embarrassment and liability. The weapon had worked too well, not too poorly. That was a problem worth solving. In October 1943, the Navy leased 4 caves in Texas and assigned Marines to guard them around the clock. Bat collection became a military operation with sentries, barbed wire, and classified protocols. Adams designed screened enclosures that could be placed over cave entrances for efficient bat capture without allowing escape. These enclosures were prefabricated at Hondo Army Airfield and transported to the cave sites under armed guard. By December 1943, the project transferred again, this time to the United States Marine Corps for final development. Operations moved to Marine Corps Air Station El Centro in California, a desert base where tests could be conducted away from populated areas. During this transition, Adams found himself increasingly marginalized from his own project. He was a civilian, a dentist, an amateur inventor. The military professionals taking over had little patience for his enthusiasms. Dr. William Young, a UCLA chemist and consultant to the National Defense Research Committee, complained officially about Adams's unreliability and his tendency toward reckless proposals that could waste resources or cause additional accidents. Marine Corps officers had to override several of Adams' suggestions for large-scale desert testing that would have been dangerous, wasteful, or both. The eccentric dentist who had charmed a president found himself squeezed out by the military bureaucracy his letter had set in motion. But the project itself moved forward with renewed purpose under Marine Corps management. Professional military discipline replaced Adams' freewheeling approach. The Marines achieved the project's most promising results. Marine Corps testing began on December 13, 1943 at El Centro. Within days, testing expanded to Dugway Proving Ground in Utah. At Dugway, the Chemical Warfare Service had constructed something remarkable for testing incendiary weapons, a replica Japanese residential district. This mock village of wood and paper buildings, built to exact Japanese construction specifications with authentic materials, had previously been used to develop the M69 incendiary bombs that would later devastate Tokyo in conventional B-29 bombing raids. Now it would test the bat bomb. In tests at Dugway, bat bombs repeatedly set the Japanese village ablaze. The results exceeded expectations. In one test series, 30 fires were started from a single release of bats. While 22 of them burned out on their own without spreading, 4 would have required professional firefighters to extinguish, and several more caused significant structural damage before self-extinguishing. This was a significant result for incendiary devices weighing less than an ounce each. The mock village was reported fully engulfed in flames within 45 minutes of a dawn release. The assessments from military observers were emphatic and consistent. The chief of incendiary testing at Dugway wrote that a reasonable number of destructive fires could be started in spite of the extremely small size of the units. He noted that the main advantage would seem to be placement within enemy structures without the knowledge of the householder or fire watchers. This concealed placement would allow fires to establish themselves before being discovered, making them far harder to suppress than conventional incendiary attacks where bombs fell visibly from the sky. The observer from the National Defense Research Committee concluded flatly that X-ray is an effective weapon. He recommended continued development toward operational deployment. Most dramatically, the chief chemist's report calculated the comparative effectiveness of bat bombs versus conventional incendiary weapons. Standard incendiary bombs dropped from B-29 bombers would produce 167 to 400 fires per bomb load over a target area. X-ray, the bat bomb, would produce 3,625 to 4,700, 48 fires from the same aircraft payload weight. This represented roughly a 10-fold to 20-fold improvement in fires started per pound of munitions dropped. Louis Fieser, the inventor of napalm and designer of the H-2 incendiary unit, ran his own calculations. He estimated bat bombs could achieve nearly 4,800 fires per mission versus 400 for standard incendiaries, a 12-fold increase in effectiveness. The data was compelling enough that no serious military analyst who reviewed the tests disputed the weapon's potential. Full-scale bomber and bat tests were planned for August 1944, the final step before declaring the weapon operational. Production of 1 million incendiary devices was scheduled to begin in May 1944 at facilities in California. The project had consumed approximately $2 million over 2.5 years of development, equivalent to roughly $35 million in current values. After all the setbacks, accidents, and transfers between services, the bat bomb was finally approaching operational readiness. It would never get there. Fleet Admiral Ernest Joseph King, Chief of Naval Operations and one of the most powerful military leaders in Washington, cancelled Project X-ray when he learned the weapon would not be combat-ready until mid-1945. The exact cancellation date remains uncertain in declassified records. Sources variously cite February, August, or October 1944. The weight of evidence points to sometime in mid to late 1944. The reason for cancellation was straightforward. Another secret weapon was advancing faster and promised a more decisive result. A weapon that would not just burn cities but vaporize them instantly. A telling anecdote from Jack Cooper's memoir, written decades after the war, captures the moment of realization. After a trip to Washington to discuss appropriations for the bat bomb project, Adams returned to tell his team about a confusing conversation. Some general he had met regarding funding had confused their secret project with another secret project apparently going on somewhere. Adams dismissed it as the silliest nonsense you ever heard of. Some kind of superbomb that used atoms. That silliest nonsense was the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb being developed at Los Alamos, New Mexico, less than 300 miles from where Adams had first watched bats emerge from Carlsbad Caverns. Stanley Lovell, the OSS research chief who had overseen the bat bomb project's early evaluation stages, later dismissed the entire enterprise with a mocking pun in his own memoirs. He called it Die Fledermaus Farce, a reference to the Johann Strauss operetta whose title translates as The Bat. Adams was devastated by the cancellation. He had devoted years of his life to this weapon. He had assembled teams, traveled thousands of miles, burned down an army base, and survived the transition through 3 military services. He believed the bat bomb could win the war against Japan with minimal loss of life. Now it was being abandoned for something he did not understand. After the atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki 3 days later on August 9, Adams wrote what became his most quoted statement. He asked people to think of thousands of fires breaking out simultaneously over a circle of 40 miles in diameter for every bomb dropped. He argued that Japan could have been devastated, yet with small loss of life. The bat bomb, he insisted, would have won the war without the terrible civilian casualties of atomic warfare. Adams maintained the bat bomb's legitimacy and superiority over atomic weapons until his death on December 29, 1970, in Tucson, Arizona. He was approximately 89 years old. His gravestone reads, Inventor, Airmail, Pickup System, Bat Warfare Project, Aerial Pellet Seeding. After the war, Adams continued inventing, his restless mind incapable of retirement. He patented a method of aerial pellet seeding, synthetic grass-growing pellets that could be dropped from aircraft to reseed burned-out western rangelands after wildfires or overgrazing. This project received United States government backing and favorable coverage in Time magazine. He also attempted, without success, to develop a fried chicken vending machine that would dispense hot, freshly cooked chicken pieces, decades before fast food made such convenience commonplace. He married Claudia Adele Painter and settled in Arizona, where he spent his final years still advocating for his wartime invention. The project's documents were classified at the highest levels and archived in government vaults, fading into obscurity for decades. Few Americans knew the bat bomb had ever existed. The definitive historical account emerged in 1992 when Jack Cooper published a book called Bat Bomb, World War II's Other Secret Weapon, through the University of Texas Press. Cooper was the teenager who had been drafted into the Army in June 1943 and assigned to Adams' bat team as a laboratory assistant. He had been present at the Carlsbad fire and had participated in the Dugway tests. After the war, he went on to become an Academy Award-nominated cinematographer and filmmaker, working as second unit director on Out of Africa and producer on Never Cry Wolf. Cooper drew on declassified archival sources and his own vivid memories to tell the story that had been hidden for half a century. Cooper died on July 30th, 2021, one of the last living participants in Project X-Ray. Today, the bat bomb is remembered through a dedicated exhibit at the Kendall County Jail Museum in Bern, Texas, located near the Ney Cave colonies that would have supplied the weapon's biological ammunition. The National Park Service has published accounts of the project as part of Carlsbad Caverns history. The History Channel and Travel Channel have produced documentary segments about it. The bat bomb has become a reliable entry in articles and books about bizarre weapons of World War II, the kind of story that sounds too strange to be true until you examine the declassified evidence. As of 1982, according to one published account, the blueprints for FISA's H-2 incendiary unit reportedly remained classified by order of the CIA. Whether they have since been declassified is unclear. The historical irony of Project X-Ray runs deep and cuts in multiple directions. The bat bomb was cancelled specifically to prioritize the Manhattan Project. Yet both weapons would have reached operational readiness at roughly the same time, mid-1945. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed an estimated 150,000 to 246,000 people, most of them civilians, in the immediate blasts and fires. Radiation sickness claimed thousands more in the weeks and months that followed. Bat bombs, by contrast, were designed to destroy property rather than lives directly. The operational plan envisioned thousands of simultaneous small fires spreading through wooden neighborhoods over several hours. In theory, this would give civilians time to evacuate. Fires that started slowly in attics and walls would produce smoke before they produced casualties. Adams' argument that bat bombs would have been more humane than atomic weapons carries genuine weight among historians who have studied the project carefully. But this argument is complicated by the reality of incendiary warfare as it was actually practiced. Mass incendiary attacks on wooden cities inevitably produce enormous civilian casualties, regardless of intent. The conventional firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, using standard M69 incendiary bombs rather than bat bombs, killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night. It was the deadliest air raid in human history, more lethal than either atomic bomb. The fires created by those conventional incendiaries spread so fast and burned so hot that fleeing civilians died in the streets. The weapon's effectiveness at starting fires was precisely what made it dangerous to human life, regardless of whether those fires were started by M69 canisters or bats carrying napalm capsules. What is beyond dispute is that the data generated by Project X-Ray was genuinely compelling by any military standard. Chemists and weapons analysts assessed the bat bomb as an order of magnitude more effective than conventional incendiaries for starting fires in Japanese urban areas, pound for pound. The project was cancelled not because it failed its tests, not because the science was flawed, not because the weapon proved impractical. It was cancelled because something even more devastating came along first, and military resources had to be concentrated. The bat bomb concept rested on sound scientific principles that the testing confirmed at every stage. Mexican free-tailed bats could indeed carry the required payloads. They could indeed survive refrigerated transport across the Pacific. They did indeed seek out exactly the kinds of concealed roosting spots that would be ideal for starting difficult-to-detect fires. FISA's incendiary devices ignited reliably after the prescribed delays. The dispersal patterns matched predictions. The fires they started were exactly as difficult to suppress as Adams had promised. The project's real lesson is not about the eccentricity of weaponizing bats. It is about the ruthless calculus of wartime priorities. A weapon that works slowly loses to a weapon that works immediately, regardless of which one causes less suffering in the end. A weapon that needs more development time loses to one that is closer to deployment. Speed of development mattered more to military planners than effectiveness per mission or minimization of civilian casualties. The certainty of atomic destruction, concentrated in a single moment, outweighed the distributed chaos of biological delivery systems that would burn cities over hours rather than seconds. By the time Fleet Admiral King made his decision, the Manhattan Project had consumed over $2 billion and employed more than 100,000 workers. The Bat Bomb, at $2 million and a few dozen researchers, never had a chance to compete for attention in those final months of the war. Doc Adams, the irrepressible dentist who talked his way from a New Mexico cave to the Oval Office, understood this bitter truth better than anyone by the time he died in 1970. He spent the last 25 years of his life insisting that his bats could have ended the war without the atomic age's terrible dawn. The declassified military records, with their tenfold improvement ratios and successful test burns and enthusiastic assessments from weapons analysts, suggest he may not have been entirely wrong. The bats of Carlsbad Caverns and the Texas Hill Country caves returned to their ordinary existence after the war ended. They knew nothing of the plans that had been made for them, of the tiny napalm bombs designed to fit their small bodies, of the wooden cities they were meant to burn across the Pacific. Each summer evening they continue to emerge in their millions to hunt insects across the desert darkness, just as they did when Adams first watched them spiral into the New Mexico sky. The colonies at Carlsbad that once numbered nearly 9 million have shrunk dramatically over the decades, victims of pesticide exposure and habitat loss. But they still fly each evening during the warmer months, a living remnant of the war that almost weaponized them. Adams' files eventually found their way into the archives at the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, where researchers can still examine the note that started everything, the presidential endorsement of a wild idea proposed by a man who was not a nut. The original memorandum, with Roosevelt's unmistakable handwriting, remains one of the more unusual artifacts from the war years. His gravestone in Tucson lists 3 inventions for any visitor who cares to look: the airmail pickup system, the Bat Warfare Project, aerial pellet seeding for burned rangelands. 3 ideas that seemed impossible until someone proved otherwise. Only one of them changed how America delivered mail. Only one of them was abandoned for something that changed the world forever. The man who dreamed them all lies beneath the Arizona desert, his legacy as unusual as any inventor in American history. Project X-Ray remains a testament to what happens when desperation meets imagination in the crucible of total war. In the darkest days of World War II, when victory seemed distant and costly, America tried everything, including arming millions of bats with napalm. The project almost worked. History chose the atom instead, but it very nearly did not. And somewhere in government archives, perhaps still classified after all these decades, the blueprints of tiny incendiary devices designed to ride on sleeping mammals may still await discovery, remnants of a war fought with ideas as strange as any in human history.